All right. Hi, everyone. Welcome to our public affairs session today. This is Science Policy 101. This is going to be one part in a three-part series talking about the easiest ways for you to engage with your policymakers. Our next sessions are going to be messaging, which is going to be on December 10th, and storytelling, which is going to be on December 16th. I'll provide that information again during the question and answer section. So here's our public affairs team that we'll be speaking with today. Myself, Caitlin Bergstrom, I'm our public affairs analyst. Lexi Shultz, who is our vice president of public affairs, and Michael Villafranca, who is our senior specialist of public affairs. You can find our social medias on there as well. Just want to go over our roadmap for what we'll be discussing today. First, we'll start off with Congress 101, which I'll be discussing just a quick overview of some quick civics lessons for Congress. Next, Lexi Shultz will be talking about budget and appropriations. Finally, Michael Villafranca will be giving a legislative overview. We'll end the session today with questions and answers. So anything that you have, we'll answer at the end of the session. So let's begin. So first, let's talk about why you should engage with your policymakers. The number one reason is that policymakers work for you. So as citizens in the United States, you play a vital role in informing policymaking decisions. Your interests and your desires are consequential for public policies. And as citizens, you're also voters. And through the electoral process, you can produce basic changes to public policy. You can vote out policymakers that don't satisfy your needs. Policymakers also really rely on constituent input to make decisions. So we have a survey here that asked members of Congress, staffers for members of Congress, if a member or senator has not already arrived at a firm decision on an issue, how much influence might the following advocacy strategies directed towards an office make on their decision? So if a lobbyist, like some of the members on our AGU public affairs staff, were to go in and ask a policymaker to make a change on an issue, there's only about 10% of surveyors that said that it would make a difference in their office. But if a constituent comes for a visit to ask about a specific issue, 50% of those offices said that it would make a big difference. And we can share lots of anecdotal stories about scientists going to speak to their policy members and changing their mind on a policy position. Policymakers also need the best information to make sound policy decisions. Your science is vital to informing science policy. Policymakers can't be experts on everything. Their staff is working on quite a wide range of issues, and even their science-dedicated staff can't know everything. So they really rely on constituent input and on your expertise as a scientist to help them make the most informed policy possible. Science and policy are also incredibly intertwined. We have just a few headlines from the last couple of months showing some science policy issues in the news. So especially with the COVID-19 pandemic, with ongoing increasing hurricanes due to climate change, there's lots of examples that you can find in the news on why science and policy are already so intertwined. And again, policymakers really do want to hear from you. They value staying in touch with their constituents, and ongoing conversations help guide policy makers in their decisions if you choose to stay engaged with your policymaker. They also really value individualized communications. I know a lot of us have probably engaged with our policymakers by signing on to petitions or signing on to form letters, but forming a one-on-one relationship with our policymakers is one of the most valuable ways that we can really have our voice heard as a constituent. They also value constituents because they're the boots on the ground and the ears in their districts. So you're the best resource to tell them what's really going on in their district. So sharing your anecdotes and your stories from the district where your policymaker serves is a really great way for them to stay engaged with their constituent base. So why does AGU care about science policy? Our mission at AGU is to advance the discovery in earth and space sciences for the benefit of humanity. And our public affairs team really works hard to help bring scientists to their policymakers and give you the best possible tools for you to make impactful and informed engagements and help push policy forward for the benefit of humanity. So let's talk now about Congress 101. So we're going to go here for a little civics lesson. Unfortunately, I couldn't make new Schoolhouse Rock songs for all of these things, but we'll talk about government as a three-ring circus. So the U.S. government has three branches: the legislative, the executive, and the judicial. So we'll primarily talk about engaging with the legislative branch, which is your members of Congress and the Senate. As elected lawmakers, legislators are expected to collate the views, the interests, the demands, and the problems of their constituents, harmonize them, and translate them into proposals for legislature. The executive branch is, of course, the president. And while the main responsibility of the executive branch is to implement public policies, many executive leaders also play a pivotal role in the initiation and formulation of policies. So this includes changing campaign platform policies and issuing executive orders. You can also, as a member of the public, engage on some of these issues, notably executive orders. That's something that executives will often hear from the public on. Finally, the judicial branch, which is, of course, the Supreme Court, doesn't have the constitutional power to initiate or formulate or implement policies. However, through its power to interpret the Constitution and laws, the judiciary brings about judicial intervention, which can not only modify policies, but also redirect policy and action and moderate implementation activities. So how does constituent advocacy in Washington work? So Congress and the White House create laws and regulations to govern citizens, but as citizens, you can influence governing behavior by participating in advocacy efforts. So this can mean showing support for a policy, asking for a change to a particular policy, telling your stories about maybe how a policy has affected you or other members of your community, helping share ideas, and providing information. So the ways that you can do this are by what we call in Washington fly-ins, which is just a constituent visit. These are looking a little bit different during COVID, but they're definitely still happening. Policymakers are still hearing from their constituent and members of the community. So these fly-ins are when organizations will host constituents from around the country in Washington to advocate for common interests or goals. So at AGU, we often have these surrounding topics like climate change. We did a virtual advocacy climate change days earlier this year. We also did one surrounding diversity, equity, and inclusion issues. So some quick facts to talk about what the staffing on Capitol Hill looks like. So there are 435 members of the House of Representatives that have voting power and 100 senators, but the staffing of those is quite larger. So there are about 6,000 personal staffers in the House and 4,000 personal staffers in the Senate. So that's someone who's working for your specific senator or member of Congress. And there's about 1,000 staffers on each side that work for a committee. So committees are part of Congress where bills and laws are initially discussed and debated. So there are various committees in both the House and the Senate, but I wanted to highlight here some key science committees. So in the House of Representatives, there's the Space, Science, and Technology Committee. There's also the Energy and Commerce Committee and the Natural Resources Committee. In the Senate, there's the Science, Commerce, and Transportation Committee, Environment and Public Works, and Energy and Natural Resources. So before you're going to go and talk to your member of Congress, it's important to know which committee they sit on, because it not only reflects what their interests are and the interests of their constituents, but it also shows what influence they might be able to have on a particular bill or issue. And I'll get to that a little bit later. So my colleague Lexi will speak later to budget and appropriations, but very quickly, The federal government has a budget that they pass each year. The fiscal year runs through September 30th. This year and the past several years, we have passed the September 30th budget deadline to pass a new budget for spending, and currently are running on a continuing resolution. So each year in the spring, the president announces their presidential budget, which just reflects some of their policy priorities and sort of where they want spending to go. The House of Representatives then drafts its own budget in response to the president's budget, and the Senate takes a go at it after that. So, like I said, Lexi will talk about this more in detail later and sort of where we are in that budget process. So let's talk about introducing a new bill into Congress. So some things to keep in mind when members of Congress are introducing new legislation is the history of that legislation, if there are bills similar that have been introduced in the past, or is this a reintroduction of another bill that has been introduced in a previous Congress. They also take into account what kind of support is needed to work on this new legislation. So do they require stakeholder input or input from important groups to the member? Do they have support in their committee? Are there co-sponsors on the bill only in their party, or is it bipartisan? And if a bill has been introduced in the other chamber, so in the House or in the Senate. There's a lot that goes into drafting new legislation, and I'll get to the legislative process in just a moment, but it's not a quick process and it's not an easy process. It can often take months to work on a bill, takes even longer for those bills to pass through all the proper channels. It typically goes back and forth numerous times and will definitely change in nature from its original draft. There's usually pushback, revision, review, some compromise, committee markup, and final votes. And it definitely does take a lot of time and energy on behalf of the member. A lot of members of Congress will come in with one particular constituent issue. So a member of Colorado might have a public lands bill that they really want to dedicate their time in Congress to work on. And that'll take up a lot of the time of the member and also their staff. So let's talk a little bit about how a bill becomes a law. So the process for this is introduction, committee consideration, floor debate, final votes, and conference committee, and going to the president's desk for a signature or a veto. So first, a member of Congress, so a representative or a senator, will introduce a bill and file it with either the House or the Senate clerk's office. The clerk's office then determines which committee that bill will go to for debate and analysis. So that's why I said that the committees that you're a member of Congress to the members of Congress that you're meeting on are really important. So if a bill is concerning education, it might go to an education committee. If it's concerning science, it will go to one of those science committees that I mentioned before. You need a simple majority to have a bill pass through a committee in both chambers, in the House and the Senate. And bills are often sent to subcommittees in the House and the Senate for extra analysis. So the processes for passing a bill out of the House and the Senate are slightly different. In both chambers, the bill is debated and amended on the House or the Senate floor, but in the House, a simple majority is all you need to pass. But in the Senate, a 3/5 majority is needed to end debate, and then a simple majority is needed to pass. So once a bill passes through either chamber, It then needs to go to the other chamber and pass in an identical form. So any amendments that are made in debate in either chamber, the bill has to get sent back to the other chamber. So if the bill starts in the House, they make a couple of changes after it gets sent to the Senate. It has to go back and forth. So this process can sometimes take a long time, especially for bills that are a little bit more controversial. So once an identical bill passes both chambers, it's sent to the president. So the president can either sign a bill immediately, or after 10 days, if they don't veto it, it becomes law. If they do veto a bill, it drops back to Congress, and Congress can override the veto by a 2/3 majority in each chamber. So even after all of that, there's still a few obstacles that bills can face even while they're still in Congress. There are thousands of bills introduced in every Congress every 2 years, and very few actually make it into law. So a bill can be ignored by a full committee. It can fail passage in its subcommittee. It can fail passage in its full committee. The Senate majority or the House Speaker can decline to put bills on the calendar. So if one chamber has passed a bill, the leadership in the other chamber doesn't necessarily have to take it up. It's up to them to put it on the schedule. Bills can also get filibustered in the Senate. Members can also add what they call poison pill amendments that would make it unfavorable to pass for maybe some members who originally supported it. And bills can fail their final vote in the chambers. So even after they pass, there's even more hurdles. So as I mentioned, the president can veto a bill. The courts can take up a bill and prevent it from being enforced. And there's also an issue of executive interpretation. So the president can write executive orders or sign statements that would prevent parts of a law from being enforced as it's originally intended. So lots of information there. Again, I don't have a super catchy song to tie everything together, but we just wanted to provide you with a quick civics reminder. So when you are engaging with your policymakers, you have an idea of what the process looks like. So let's talk about that briefly. In our workshop on December 10th, we'll talk a bit more about messaging to policymakers and how to talk to your policymakers, but I want to go over that quickly in case you don't have time to attend those sessions. So it's really up to you as a constituent to make sure that science is a priority for your representative or your member of Congress. So I'm sure when a lot of us have seen when there's sort of big ticket issues like healthcare, Social Security, or education that are in the news, and a lot of us are implored to call our member of Congress, the folks actually picking up those calls in your member's office have a checklist in front of them when people are calling, and they'll physically check off how many people are calling about a particular issue or yes, no on an issue. So again, healthcare, Social Security, education, those are all things that are typically on the ballot, but we're here to ask you to really put science on the ballot. So there's a common phrase in Washington that we say, which is, if you're not at the table, you're what's for dinner. And what we mean by that for you all is if scientists and science supporters aren't speaking up for science to policymakers, no one will. And it will be considered less important by policymakers and less likely to receive funding and more likely to receive funding cuts for these policymakers not stepping up and really putting science on the line. So as I said before, engaging with your policymakers is incredibly valuable, and you really can make a difference. Policymakers like to stay in touch with their constituents. they like those personalized communications, and they like to know what you're seeing and take your knowledge into account when they're making policy decisions. So when you're talking to your policymakers, it's important to think about how your work impacts your state or district when you're telling some of these more personalized stories. Think about what your legislators' values are and what's the story behind your science. So again, we'll go into these in our later workshops a bit more, but we just want to get you thinking about how to frame your message when you're going to engage with your policymakers. A quick overview of some resources that you can utilize to learn more about your policymakers when you're going to engage. So you can look at their websites for their biographies and finding some of their position statements, look at their voting record and legislative record, check their social media, and reach out to your government relations folks either at your institution or folks like us at AGU. So with that, I'm going to kick it over to Lexi Shultz to talk about the budget.
So thank you, Caitlin. My name is Lexi Shultz, and I'm going to be going over the basics of federal science funding in the United States and how it works. So the first question is, why is science funding so important that we're taking the time to do a whole presentation on it? Well, the simple truth is that the U.S. Earth and Space Science enterprise depends on federal government funding. And that funding comes from a number of different federal science agencies, many of which are shown here. So how does the federal spending process work? This complicated slide gives the process in a nutshell. First, the White House creates a proposed budget and spending plan for all federal government agencies and sends that proposal to Congress. That's supposed to happen in February of every year, although sometimes the timeline slips. Next, each branch of Congress, the House and the Senate, is supposed to consider an overall budget bill, which is a big picture proposal for how much money the federal government spends overall. And each chamber must vote on their version of the bill and then work out the differences between the two. Then the appropriations or spending committees in each branch of Congress take that overall budget bill and decide how to divide that number into each of the 12 spending bills they have to work on. And then subcommittees of each appropriations committee take that number and decide how to divide it even further into individual agency and program funds. And again, each chamber must vote on their own versions of each of the 12 spending bills and then work out the differences between the two. Then and only then can the spending bills go back to the president for him to sign and become law. The irony is, as complicated as this is, rarely do the spending bills happen in as neat and orderly a manner as this. But before I get to that, I want to set some context for you for where science fits in with the overall spending picture for the United States. So to start, I want to explain a little bit more about the difference between those big picture budget bills and then the appropriations bills and where science fits into all of that. So one thing to keep in mind is that while the US outlay for fiscal year 2021, which is what we're in now, our fiscal year began October 1st. So that overall outlay is 4.8 trillion, but most of that is taken up by things over which Congress has no discretion to change. That's what this graph is showing. The only parts that Congress gets to decide about are what's shown here in red and blue, the so-called discretionary funds for defense in red and non-defense in blue. And of those smaller pieces of the pie, only the tiny pink and lighter blue slivers are what goes to research and development. And that's all research and development for every discipline and every program. So here's a different way of looking at the same thing, but shown over time. As you can see, while in the early 60s, discretionary funds, the red and blue bands for defense and non-defense discretionary spending respectively, made up a considerable chunk of overall federal spending, that percentage is declining over time as mandatory spending on things like Social Security, Medicare, and the interest on our debt have gone up. Meanwhile, the non-defense part of the pie, the blue band, has declined even greater than the defense side slice. So where does the research and development as part of the federal budget come in? So science makes up only a portion of the non-defense discretionary spending, because included with that spending is everything else, like for transportation, the arts, housing, and so forth. So in this chart, you see what part of the total federal budget is made up by non-defense research and development. That's the blue line. The high mark was back 50 years ago or so in the yellow circle, when non-defense R&D funding made up about 6% of the total budget. But it's been declining pretty much ever since then, and now it only makes up about 2% of the budget or less. So putting the US figure in a global context, while the US is still spending more in overall R&D dollars compared to many other countries, so look at the chart on the left where the US is in red, it's actually been increasing the US has been increasing that funding annually at a much slower rate of growth than many other countries, especially China, Korea, Taiwan, and Israel, and that's the chart on the right. So getting even more granular, as we look at non-defense research and development, the largest increase in spending has been for health. That's the big blue band here. While most Earth and space science falls within the yellow, green, and white bands, which are growing much less quickly. So now I want to switch gears for a moment and talk about this year in particular and where we are in the process. Well, President Trump did indeed release a budget proposal to Congress in February. In his budget, he made such drastic cuts to science and other areas, frankly, that the entire proposal was simply largely ignored by Congress. Next, if you recall from the beginning of this talk, Congress was supposed to set an overall top line amount for the budget through budget bills before sending that figure on to the appropriations committees. But that never happened. Instead, the appropriations committees were forced to pick their own overall numbers and ended up simply relying on the previous year's figures. So the House of Representatives actually went through the normal process. Each of the 12 subcommittees passed bills funding portions of the overall federal government, and those bills were sent to the full House, which in turn voted on and passed them. But meanwhile, the Senate has completed exactly 0 spending bills, none, which means that the process cannot be finalized because each chamber has to pass legislation before it can go to the president to be signed. So our fiscal year officially started October 1st. What that means is with no funding, the government will have to shut down. But instead, so far this year, Congress punted, and they passed a bill known as a continuing resolution to simply keep funding the federal government in exactly the same manner at exactly the same levels as last year. And this lasts until December 11th. So when we look a little bit at the specific numbers for science funding this year, this chart shows the percentage change in select science funding for different agencies compared with funding for the previous year. The orange bars represent what President Trump's proposal to Congress from February included. And you see those orange bars descend below last year's funding levels. And you can see with very few exceptions, NASA, for example, the president proposed some pretty drastic cuts. For example, the Department of Energy Office of Science would have been cut by more than 15%. NOAA would have been cut by more than 40%. And the US Geological Survey would have been cut by nearly a quarter. The blue bars represent what the House actually passed for this year's spending. And you can see that with few exceptions, they would have increased spending, albeit by very small percentages. Only NOAA would have seen an increase of more than 5%. The rest were 5% or less, and some were essentially flat funded. So the charts on this slide and the next provide a bit more detail within a few agencies. So the yellow bars again represent President Trump's request, while the blue bars represent what the House bills would fund the agencies at for this year, with the center line equaling 0 change or flat funding from last year. So these charts show some of the specific programs within the National Science Foundation and NASA. And again, you can see some of the discrepancies. Here, President Trump would have actually increased the NASA budget considerably for human exploration and space technology, but that's it. Everything else would have been a big cut. So these are similar charts showing some more detail for the Department of Energy Office of Science and for NOAA. Again, the yellow bar was President Trump's request, and the blue bar is what the House would fund. And, you know, even within individual programs, any increases would have been pretty small, and the proposed cuts from the president would have been pretty big. So this is where we find ourselves to date. On December 11th, the government shuts down unless Congress acts quickly to pass spending bills, which as of the recording of this presentation, they have not done. So here are the possible actions. Either the Senate acts super fast to pass all of its spending bills, or the entire Congress avoids the regular process altogether. Remember how I said that often happens? By passing one mammoth bill that would fund every single agency. Or they pass yet another continuing resolution for some amount of time, or in fact, the government shuts down. So what does this mean for science? As I'm sure I don't have to tell you, all this uncertainty is absolutely terrible for science. Projects can't get planned, data and opportunities are lost, and less established scientists suffer the most, which impacts future careers and future innovation in science. And all of this comes on top of the terrible uncertainty imposed by the pandemic this year. So what can we do? Frankly, we need to speak up. We can't keep quiet because science is essential, and cuts to it have very real consequences for our nation and our world. And if we don't speak up, who will? AGU itself makes very specific requests of Congress. First, we ask them to end the uncertainty and pass funding bills as soon as possible and make any additional continuing resolution very short. Second, we ask them to start making some real increases to science funding over time, even if modest, steady increases in inflation-adjusted dollars that continue for some time could provide more of the certainty needed for innovation in the sciences and make up for some of the loss in growth in R&D funding that we've seen for decades. AGU asks for a real, that is inflation-adjusted, 4% increase in funding for all science agencies every year. And you can play a role as well. If you are a US resident and have representatives and senators, you can ask them to support funding for your science, and in fact, all science. As a constituent, you have the right to communicate with your elected leaders. And I'm often asked, well, what if I work for a federal agency? And I can't do that. But in fact, as a constituent, you can. As long as you're not advocating for your own specific program, you can still talk about the value of science and the importance of overall science funding. So share what you do with your elected officials. Where do you get your funding? Is it from a federal science agency, at least in part? How has funding helped you? And what are the implications to your work and career if that funding is cut or goes away? How does your work benefit society? Are there economic benefits, environmental ones, national security impacts? How does your work, or how could your work, help your own state or community? And how does it affect your representatives' constituents? So frankly, we can't make progress without you, not only in terms of your research, but also in terms of your speaking up for science, because your voice matters. And, we really need you. So thank you so much for paying attention to this presentation. And with that, I will turn it over to Michael Villafranca to tell you more about other types of science legislation in Congress besides spending bills. Thank you.
Thank you, Lexi. My name is Michael Villafranca, and I'm the Senior Specialist for Public Affairs at AGU. So I'm going to go over the current legislative overview. So I'm going to start off just talking a little bit about some legislation that passed during the 116th Congress, which is currently going to end at the end of this year. We'll be starting the 117th Congress next year in January, once new Congress has been started, I believe mid-January. So some highlights from the legislation that has passed is the Digital Coast Act. This is Senate Bill 1069. This passed recently in the past few months. This provides statutory authority to revise NOAA's Digital Coast program, focusing on acquisition and integration of key data sets needed for coastal management. The ProSwift Act. So the ProSwift is a shorter version of promoting research and observations of space weather to improve the forecasting of tomorrow. This is Senate Bill 881. This passed both the House and the Senate and has been signed into law. This bill or this law directs NOAA, NSF, and the Department of Defense and NASA to carry out specified space weather activities, including solar wind, solar flare, and geospacer observation, essential to space weather forecasting. And the third one highlight I want to mention is the Rural STEM Education Act. There's only a House version which passed. Senate version of this bill has not been introduced and likely won't be introduced before the end of the year, but it's worth noting. So this bill expands STEM opportunities for students in rural areas, and this is a bill that we pushed heavily this past summer during our DEI Virtual Advocacy Days event. I also want to talk about some other pending legislation, and I do again want to re-highlight the fact that we are coming up on the end of this current Congress. A lot of these bills will not likely make it all the way through, but these are important bills and will need to be reintroduced in the new Congress next year. So the Women and Minorities in STEM Booster Act and the Keep STEM Talent Act, these are some STEM education bills that have been introduced in Congress. The Women and Minorities in STEM Booster Act provides NSF grants to retain women and minorities in STEM fields. And the Keep STEM and Talent Act provides work visas to foreign students with masters or above in STEM fields. Another STEM bill is the Combating Sexual Harassment in STEM Act. This one passed the House earlier in 2019. It was introduced in the Senate by Senator Harris, and it directs funding to NSF for grants to better understand factors contributing to and consequences of sexual harassment in STEM fields. The next few, National Landslide Preparedness Act, the Prepare Act of 2019. These two are hazards bills. The National Landslides Preparedness Act, that one passed in the House, and it is currently waiting to be passed on the Senate floor. This one directs the USGS to establish a national landslides hazards reduction program that will help at-risk communities to be prepared and protected and to mitigate losses. And then the Prepare Act, which is also known as the Preparedness and Risk Management for Extreme Weather Patterns, Assuring Resilience and Effectiveness Act. This is a bipartisan bill to enhance the federal government's preparedness for extreme weather and its ability to respond to improving regional coordination, with the overall goal being improved resilience and mitigated financial risk in the face of extreme weather events. I'm not going to go heavily into the other bills because I want to continue on to make sure that we cover another kind of special area, especially for this year, which is COVID-19 relief funding. Lexi did go over, obviously, budget. This bill is related to budgets. You'll see kind of different various relief funding bills that were introduced throughout the year. Some of them you'll see from this diagram that some of them touched certain agencies. The RISE Act, which I'll talk about here shortly, focused a lot heavily on the science agencies. So let's talk a little bit about that. So the research investment to spark the economy, or the RISE Act, this one, it authorizes research and science agencies, including NOAA, NSF, NASA, EPA, the Department of Energy, USGS, to provide support for research regarding COVID-19 or research disrupted by the COVID-19 pandemic. Support under this bill is supposed to be provided through federal science agencies with at least $50 million in basic and applied science research obligations in FY 2020. And this, of course, can be used for a variety of ways that the bill designates. But again, because we're getting up to the end of the year, we're hoping that we can get both versions passed, but the likelihood is kind of slim. So these are bills that obviously we would want to continue pushing for reintroduction and passage in the next Congress, given the disruption that the research community has experienced because of the COVID-19 pandemic. Now we're going to move on to the Q&A discussion. Before we move on to that, I just want to highlight that if we are not able to answer any of the questions that you have or get to all of your questions today, please contact us at sciencepolicy@agu.org. We're always happy to help and answer any questions that you may have regarding legislation, the government processes, the budget process, any legislation that you're interested in learning more about. You can also follow us on Twitter at AGU Policy. We put a lot of information out there, especially about legislation and opportunities for you to engage.
All right, thank you so much everyone for watching our presentations. We are going to start with our Q&A section in just a moment, but first, have to admit that we had some virtual presentation magic happen. All of those sessions were recorded a couple of weeks ago, and there's a few updates that we'd like to share since the election. So Lexi, do you want to start off?
Yes, I will. Thanks, Caitlin. So since we recorded this, we've had a major election in the United States, and we're going to have a new president in a few weeks. And Congress, right now is looking like controlled by the same people, but the balance may shift. So the bottom line is that in a new Congress and a new administration, first of all policy pieces, unless they're passed between now and the start of the new Congress, they die and they have to be reintroduced. Many of the pieces of legislation that Michael spoke about will be reintroduced. Some others might not, but we're going to have to start tracking again. And the second thing I'll say is that from a funding standpoint, we are actually, I did some good projections. We are actually no closer to actually having spending bills than we were when this was recorded prior to the election. But I do think that there will be some movement. We can talk more about what's going to happen with the appropriations bills, but a new president is going to have very, very different priorities for science funding. So when President-elect Biden, when he takes office, puts out his proposed budget, let's say that's February, it will probably look very different than what we saw from the proposed science budget from President Trump. President-elect Biden has already signaled that science will be a big priority for him. And while we don't yet have ideas about numbers, I think they will almost assuredly look more supportive of science than what I showed in the presentation from last year.
Great, thanks, Lexi. So we can get to questions now. Our first question here is it more important to contact our senators or our representatives for the current budget to be passed? Michael, do you want to take that question?
Sure. So right now, since the House has already passed their appropriations bills, and it's right now it's kind of in the Senate's hands to get their bills passed, it's most important right now to be pushing on your senators, reaching out to them and making sure that you tell them that it's important that these bills get passed and that we avoid a government shutdown. So yeah, it's definitely at this point in time, very important to focus on the senators.
Great. Our next question is, how likely is another government shutdown? Lexi, do you want to talk a little bit about this?
Yes, and that is a great question. So as I mentioned in the presentation, the current deadline for spending bills to pass is December 11th. It's still December 11th. There is a lot of movement towards another one of these continuing resolutions that I spoke about. So basically keeping things going at their current levels for a short period of time. Right now, it looks like the next expiration date for that might be before Christmas. So that gives the Senate some more time to act. And there's a lot of movement towards negotiations, towards one of those all-encompassing so-called omnibus appropriations bills. So if I were a betting person, I would say that the Congress will actually do its part to get that bill done. That said, President Trump has kind of signaled different things about whether he would sign spending bills or not. And so there's still a fair amount of uncertainty as to what's going to happen there. I have some strong hope that we won't see a government shutdown because I'm not sure that anyone sees it in their interest, but there's enough uncertainty that we can't know for sure.
Great, thanks, Lexi. So the next question is, if Congress gives NIH a really big boost in funding, is that going to count as the 4% increase for scientific agencies? Michael, do you want to talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, so for our priorities, and when we talk about science agencies, I mean, obviously there's quite a large amount of science agencies throughout the administration. For the ones that we focus on, and especially with regards to NIH, for us, the National Institute for Environmental Health Science is one of the kind of sub-agencies under or centers underneath the NIH umbrella that we focus on. So for us, when we're talking about a 4% increase, we're talking specifically about NIHS. So for NIH, if NIH were to get that 4% increase bump, that may not necessarily trickle down to NIHS in the form of a 4%. So I'm hoping that this answers your question. So yeah, for us, when we're talking about 4%, we want to see kind of the individual science agencies at minimum get that 4% increase. And Lexi, I don't know if you have anything that you want to add to that.
Just to emphasize, we really want it to be across the board, and very often NIH has gotten big increases, but it's not like if they get enough so that it averages across everything so that they all get 4%, that's sufficient. That doesn't provide certainty or support for innovation in many of the areas of sciences that are so important. So.
Yeah, I think NASA is a good example of this too. So the last couple of years, NASA has seen a large boost in funding, but it's primarily for the Mars program, for the Artemis program. And that's all fine and well, but the programs that we look at specifically, so the science directorate, some of the other research programs are taking cuts as a result of those big increases for human exploration. So we are looking at a pretty granular level for a lot of these things. But like Lexi said, we really like to see stuff across the board. So the next question is, more generally, if an undergraduate student is interested in a career in science policy, what is the best way to prepare? What can they do as a student? And do they need to major in a science discipline for credibility with lawmakers? So I will take this question as a person who was an undergraduate who was interested in science policy and needed to figure out what to do. So I did a lot of research in my undergrad, and I was looking for something that was a little bit more applied when I was thinking about what I wanted to do after I was an undergrad. I was pretty burnt out from doing field work every summer. I took a couple of science policy classes that sort of gave me a path to see what some other options I could use if my degree were to do science policy. I ended up working in federal consulting for a little while. So I worked at a firm, contracted with federal agencies, and helped do some research there. We like to say that internships are a really great way for you to explore some science policy topics. So lots of nonprofits and other groups offer internships for undergraduates or students. I did an internship with the White House here in DC, and that was how I sort of got my science policy start. AGU also offers internships. We do 4 internships a year. The House of Representatives and Senate does internships. So I think just trying to get your feet wet and figure out what areas of policy are most interesting to you. To the question of, do you need to major in science discipline for credibility with lawmakers? If you're coming in with credibility as a scientific expert, I think having that degree helps, but I will speak for Michael in saying that his degree is not in science. His degree is in public policy, and we all work on the same team. My degree is in science. Lexi has a chemistry degree and a law degree. So you can come from a lot of different angles to sort of get to the same ends or means. But yeah, if you have questions about science policy things too, you can definitely email us at sciencepolicy@agu.org, and we're happy to point you in the direction of some good resources. I'm happy to speak more to you as well, to the questioner. Lexi or Michael, do you have anything else to add? It was a long answer.
I think you covered it.
I think you covered it really well. Just a variety of ways to get there, and definitely, you know, encourage people at whatever level from undergrad on up, that there's still many different avenues to be in.
And I'll also plug, so next Wednesday, December 9th, we are having the second of our Science Policy Starts at Home series, which we'll have a panel of scientists who are in kind of who took different pathways into science policy. One of our panelists is actually still in academia doing research, but does kind of science policy advocacy on the side. And then we actually have a couple of other panelists who are actually working within the government who have science backgrounds. So I invite you to definitely to join us for that event as well.
Great, thanks, Michael. All right, the next question is, I was very concerned about the executive move for the USDA to Kansas City and the loss of the scientific talent because of the move. Is there something legislatively we should be thinking about to push for scientists in the future? I think Lexi is probably most prepared to take this, but I'll just kick off to say, typically in every Congress, there's some piece of legislation that comes out that is asking for this exact kind of move. So I believe that there was one introduced in the 116th Congress, the current Congress, asking to distribute all of the different scientific agencies across the country and outside of DC. So if you see those kinds of pieces of legislation, you can definitely contact your representatives and ask them to vote against it or lobby against it. But Lexi, do you want to talk a little bit more about what we can do, especially with the new administration, to prevent moves like this?
Yeah, so I mean, one thing is, because I was talking to some of my colleagues who are specifically focused on the agricultural sciences and whose members were really part of the offices that were moved to Kansas City. Essentially, there's enough solidity in some of the offices that they're finding other scientists to fill the position, and they think it's sort of a done deal. But that's not the case for everything. And what that means is, I think it's going to be hard to move the offices back at this point, but what we really need are qualified scientists to fill them. And I think there's a lot that we can do. Right now, I think because President-elect Biden is coming in and he's saying he wants to restore scientific integrity, we heard in one of the first plenaries to this event, John Podesta, who's very well connected to the Biden campaign, say that a scientific integrity initiative is going to be one of the first things that they do. I think there's going to be a lot of support there, and there may not be a need for congressional action to try to address it, but we do need people to serve, people to apply for jobs in the federal government, people to, you know, encourage others to do so. So I think that's one thing that we can really do. I will say issues related to scientific integrity in general and in ensuring good science advice for the administration, that is something that does come up in Congress in various forms. There is a scientific integrity bill, for example, that is been very kind of a perennial for the last few years that would codify some of the administration's scientific integrity policies so that it doesn't just depend on each administration. So there are definitely things to watch for. And I would encourage anyone to sign up for science policy alerts through AGU and to email us for any information about this stuff so that you can kind of stay on top of anything you're interested in.
Great, thanks, Lexi. So next question, you haven't talked about international science policy. Can you describe some of the process? I think Michael can talk about that. We have lots of great international science policy events happening.
Yeah, so for international science policy, I mean, that term itself kind of covers it's very broad. It covers anywhere from like locally here in the US, it can cover immigration issues. It can cover, obviously like visa issues, but also the issues that are happening, across borders. So diplomacy across borders from country to country. It can,
thinking international science policy for us is also thinking about how other countries are handling what we're talking about here locally in the U.S. So for us, we're trying to, as our team, our public affairs team, since we are an international scientific society, we are, as a public affairs team, trying to become more global and provide more support to our international members. And so we are working in collaboration and with some of our partners at other scientific societies, such as AGU, to put together resources and contacts for everybody. We do have a couple of international science policy events, as Caitlin mentioned, coming up in the next couple of weeks. The next one is also on December 9th. It is called Science Policy Around the World, where we'll have a panel of speakers from various countries who will be speaking specifically about the science policy issues that they're seeing and how they're working on those particular issues and how scientists in those countries can get involved. And then we're having another one on the 15th called International Science Policy and Diplomacy, where we have a panel of speakers from various international science bodies, such as the IPCC, UNESCO, who will be speaking kind of about their agency's work and how their science bodies help promote science integrity on a more global scale, as well as collaboration amongst trans-border amongst countries. And I don't know, Lexi, if you want to add anything to that question.
No, just to say that we are very, very interested in engaging more in science policy in other nations. Right now, what we're very interested in is people who know the ins and outs of science policy issues and processes in different countries. And so if you yourself or you know of anyone who can help make those connections, we can publicize those through our website. We can learn from you or from others. And we'd like to do that. We're trying to grow. We're obviously a very, very broad science society, which is both fantastic and, insurmountable opportunities, I had a boss used to say. So.
So our next question, and this might be our last one. I don't think we'll be able to get to all the questions, so we apologize. So next question is, what should we do if our representatives already support funding for science? Are there other ways to influence science policy? Yes, there are absolutely other ways to influence science policy. I will plug for our next series in the workshop. So we're doing a messaging for storytellers on December 10th and a messaging for policymakers on December 10th and storytelling for advocacy on December 16th. So if your representative's already a pro-science office, that's amazing. It's a really good opportunity for you to offer yourself as a resource to those offices so that when they are writing science policy legislation or they're looking to influence more policy, you can be the person to help influence them and to be a resource to them. So we'll talk a little bit more about that in the workshop next week that we hope all of you will be able to join if you're interested in this. Let's do one more question here. Are you aware of any geoscience departments who offer courses on policy engagement for geoscientists as a way to see that there are many ways to use your science degree? So I'm not personally aware of any departments about this. I believe that there was some discussion in the chat about some of this, but your societies like AGU are a really good way to use this. We're happy to offer you these resources, and you're more than welcome to share any information that you learn here with your departments and to help your universities. So with that, if you want to go to the slide. 52886 to AGU, you can get signed up for our system. So any other questions, please feel free to email us at sciencepolicy@agu.org. I want to thank everyone again for joining us today, staying a little bit later on a Friday for the East Coast, but thanks again. Please enjoy your evening and enjoy your weekend, and happy first week of fall meeting. All wrapped.